The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush, a Marine forward operating base was about to disappear from the map, and nobody in Bagram knew why the gunship scheduled for close air support had gone silent 40 minutes ago. The operations center felt the weight of it, that specific texture of dread when good men are dying and the cavalry isn't coming. Lieutenant Colonel Vance stood motionless at the command table, his jaw working around words he couldn't say, while intelligence officers cycled through satellite feeds that showed nothing but darkness and the white-hot signatures of muzzle flashes converging on a single point. The Marines weren't calling for help anymore. They were just transmitting coordinates, over and over, like a prayer to a god who'd stopped listening. What nobody knew yet was that Captain Rylan Kess was already airborne. She'd been 300 miles south, running a routine patrol over Helmand Province in her A-10 Thunderbolt II, the twin-engine beast the infantry called the Warthog. The aircraft was older than she was, a relic from Cold War thinking with titanium bathtub armor wrapped around the pilot and a 30mm rotary cannon that sounded like the sky tearing in half. Rylan had been flying her for 6 years, and the crew chief said she could make the ungainly jet dance like a ballerina if the situation called for it. But tonight wasn't about elegance. Tonight was about hearing something on guard frequency that made her blood run cold. A Marine lieutenant's voice, steady despite the impossible, saying they had 30 minutes before they were overrun and no air support inbound. She didn't ask permission. She just banked north and pushed the throttles forward. The thing about Rylan was that people had been underestimating her since flight school. She was compact, dark-haired, with a face that looked too young and a voice that sounded too quiet over the radio. The fighter jocks at Nellie's had called her Whisper during training, and they'd meant it as mockery, the woman who talked so soft you could barely hear her check in. But the A-10 community was different. They were all apostates, the pilots who chose the slow, ugly gunship over the glamorous jets, who understood that war wasn't about speed or altitude but about staying in the fight when everyone else had gone home. They'd kept the call sign, but they'd changed what it meant. Now Whisper was coming, and she hadn't told anyone. The Hindu Kush rose beneath her like the backbone of some ancient god, peaks cutting toward stars that seemed close enough to touch at 18,000 feet. Rylan kept her breathing steady as she descended through the mountain passes, the A-10's turbofans whispering against the thin air. The heads-up display painted green vectors across her canopy, but she was flying on instinct now, that peculiar sense that came from spending more time in cockpits than in her own apartment. The terrain following radar showed the valleys snaking below like dark rivers, and somewhere ahead in that darkness, men were counting their last magazines. The Marine frequency crackled in her helmet. Any station, this is Phantom 2-1. We are danger close on all sides. I say again, danger close. We need guns on target or we need extraction. Over. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Holt, though Rylan didn't know his name yet. What she heard was the control, the way he kept his transmission professional even though she could hear small arms fire rippling behind his words like a snare drum played by a madman. She switched her radio to his frequency, kept her voice low and calm. Phantom 2-1, Hog 3-7. I'm 8 mics out with a full combat load. Say your position and I'll get you some breathing room. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, but it contained universes. Confusion, hope, the desperate mathematics of men trying to figure out if this was real. Hog 3-7, Phantom, who sent you? We were told no air available. Nobody sent me, Phantom. I sent myself. Now give me coordinates and mark your position. She could almost hear the lieutenant deciding whether to trust her. Then his voice came back harder, faster. Grid November Bravo 417-683. We're 300 meters east of that position in a wadi. Enemies on ridgelines north and south, approximately 50 combatants, PKM machine guns and RPGs confirmed. We've got red smoke for friendly position. Rylan was already programming the coordinates into her targeting computer, her hands moving across switches and dials with the efficiency of long practice. The A-10 was analog in a digital world, a jet that required you to think like a mechanic and fly like an artist. She loved it for that. The enemy positions would be dug into the hillsides, probably in caves or behind rock formations that made them nearly invisible to conventional targeting systems. Copy all, Phantom. Coming in from the south, keep your heads down. The wadi appeared on her display as she crested the last ridge, and she saw it the way a falcon sees a rabbit. Complete picture, instant understanding. The scene below was painted in the green phosphor of her night vision. The Marines had taken position in a dried riverbed, using the natural depression for cover, but the enemy had the high ground on both sides. Muzzle flashes sparked along the ridgelines like malevolent fireflies, converging fire that was chewing up the rocks around the Americans. The red smoke grenade looked like a flower blooming in hell. Rylan counted 4 wounded by the way they were positioned, and she could see the geometry of the situation with cold clarity. The Marines had maybe 20 minutes before they ran out of ammunition, or the enemy closed for a final assault. She came in low, just 200 feet off the deck, the A-10's profile dark against the darker mountains. The jet wasn't built for stealth, but at night with no lights, she was just another shadow. She selected her 30 cannon, felt the familiar weight of the weapon system come alive beneath her seat. The GAU-8 Avenger held 1,200 rounds, each one the size of a milk bottle, made from depleted uranium that could punch through tank armor. Against infantry in the open, it was apocalyptic. Phantom, guns hot in 30 seconds. Danger close means I'm coming in right on top of you. If you've got anything you want to say to your mother, now's the time. Holt's response was immediate. Cleared hot, Hog. We'll take our chances with you over them. Rylan rolled, inverted, and pulled, the G-forces pressing her into her seat as the world spun. The targeting pipper settled on the northern ridgeline, where the heaviest concentration of fire was coming from. She squeezed the trigger, and the A-10 shuddered as the cannon roared to life. The sound was legendary, a thunderous BRRRT that lasted 2 seconds and sent 70 rounds downrange at nearly a mile per second. The northern ridge erupted in a line of explosions, rock and earth fountaining into the air as the depleted uranium rounds obliterated everything they touched. She pulled up hard, rolled right, and came around for another pass. The southern ridgeline this time. The enemy fighters were scrambling now, some trying to relocate, others freezing in confusion. That moment of hesitation cost them everything. Ryland's second burst walked across their positions like the hand of an angry god, and the firing from the south went silent. Good hits, good hits. Holt's voice was electric now, alive with sudden hope. North side is shredded. We've got movement west, maybe 15 combatants trying to flank. Ryland banked west, her eyes scanning the darkness. The flanking force was moving through a narrow defile between 2 rock formations, single file, thinking they were hidden. She switched to her Hydra rockets, the 2.75-inch unguided missiles that the A-10 carried in pods under its wings. They weren't precision weapons, but in a choke point like this, precision was irrelevant. She pickled off 6 rockets in rapid succession, each one leaving a white trail across her canopy as it screamed toward the defile. The impacts came like a drum roll, overlapping explosions that collapsed the rock walls and turned the narrow passage into a tomb. The radio stayed quiet for a moment. Then Holt's voice came back, different now, softer. Hog 37, Phantom 21. I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you just saved 23 lives. We are combat effective and consolidating position. Copy, Phantom. I'm going to orbit overhead until the situation stabilizes. You need me to convince any more of your friends out there to call it a night. Negative, Hog. I think you made your point pretty clear. Ryland smiled inside her oxygen mask, though nobody could see it. The A-10 climbed back to altitude, and she began a slow racetrack pattern over the wadi, her sensors sweeping the surrounding area for any additional threats. Below, she could see the Marines moving with renewed purpose, establishing a defensive perimeter, tending to their wounded. The red smoke had dissipated, replaced by the infrared strobes they'd activated now that they had air cover. Her fuel gauge showed she had about 90 minutes of loiter time before she'd need to head back to Bagram. She intended to use every minute of it. The thing about close air support was that you didn't leave until you were certain the job was done. Too many pilots treated it like a mission to check off a list. Ryland treated it like a sacred trust. Those men down there had families who expected them to come home. She was going to make sure they did. The sun was starting to paint the eastern horizon orange when the relief force finally arrived. Two Black Hawks escorted by an Apache gunship that had launched from Jalalabad. Ryland watched them land in the wadi, watched the Marines load their wounded and begin extraction. Holt's voice came over the radio one last time before they lifted off. "Hog 37, we're clear and heading home. I don't know how to thank you properly, but when we get back, first beers on me." "I'll hold you to that, Phantom. Hog 37 is RTB, clear." She turned south, the A-10's nose dropping as she began the long flight back to Bagram. The adrenaline was starting to fade now, replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion that always followed combat. Her hands were steady on the stick, but she could feel the tremor waiting beneath the surface. It would come later in her quarters, when the day finally caught up with her. What Ryland didn't know yet was that the radio transmission she'd intercepted had been heard by several other aircraft in the area. An Air Force AWACS plane had been tracking her since she deviated from her patrol route, watching with growing interest as she'd flown north without authorization. They'd recorded everything: her radio calls, her attack runs, the results. By the time she landed at Bagram 2 hours later, her squadron commander was waiting on the tarmac with an expression that could have meant anything. Major Dennis Carver was a 20-year veteran with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for running the tightest A-10 squadron in theater. He watched Ryland's jet taxi in, noted the empty rocket pods and the faint smell of cordite that clung to the aircraft. When she climbed down from the cockpit, still wearing her helmet, he didn't say anything at first. Just stood there in the dawn light, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Captain Kess," he finally said, "you want to tell me why you decided to conduct an unsanctioned combat mission without clearance from command?" Ryland pulled off her helmet, her dark hair matted with sweat. She met his eyes without flinching. "Marines were dying, sir. I had weapons and fuel. Seemed like simple math to me." Carver studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the operations building. "Colonel Vance wants to see you, now." The walk across the tarmac felt longer than the flight had been. Other pilots were emerging from their quarters, drawn by the unusual activity. Ryland could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting to spread. Lieutenant Colonel Vance's office was sparse and utilitarian, decorated only with a map of Afghanistan and a photograph of his family. He was sitting behind his desk when Ryland entered, and he didn't invite her to sit. Major Carver closed the door behind them and took position near the wall, his expression still carefully neutral. Vance let the silence build for 10 seconds. Then he leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Captain Kess, do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" "Yes, sir. I violated airspace protocols, conducted unauthorized combat operations, and failed to report my intentions to command. I accept full responsibility for my actions." "Full responsibility." Vance's voice was flat. "That's good, because there's going to be an inquiry. The Air Force doesn't just let pilots go rogue whenever they feel like it, regardless of the outcome." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Vance stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the flight line. "Because from where I'm sitting, you could have started an international incident. You could have bombed the wrong target. You could have killed those Marines instead of saving them. There are reasons we have protocols, Captain. Reasons we don't let individual pilots make strategic decisions on their own. Ryland said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Vance turned back to face her. But you didn't bomb the wrong target. You didn't kill anyone except the enemy. And those 23 Marines are alive right now because you decided to trust your instincts instead of waiting for permission. He paused. Lieutenant Holt's already filed his after-action report. He's recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Says you flew danger-close missions in mountainous terrain at night under fire with precision that saved his entire unit. Something shifted in Ryland's chest, but she kept her face neutral. I was just doing my job, sir. Your job is to follow orders, Captain. What you did last night was something else entirely. Vance returned to his desk, sat down heavily. You're grounded pending investigation. That's non-negotiable. But between you and me, if I'd been in your cockpit and heard that transmission, I'd like to think I would have done the same thing. The inquiry took 3 weeks. During that time, Ryland was confined to base, her wings temporarily pulled, while investigators pored over every detail of the mission. They interviewed Holt and his Marines. They analyzed her radio transmissions, her flight data recorder, even the gun camera footage from her targeting pod. The story spread through Bagram like wildfire, then beyond. Marines started showing up at the A-10 squadron asking to meet Whisper, the pilot who'd come out of nowhere to save their brothers. Other aviators argued about whether she should be court-martialed or given a medal. Ryland spent the time in her quarters, reading and trying not to think about the investigation. She wrote letters to her family, her mother in Oregon, her younger brother finishing college in Arizona. She didn't tell them about the inquiry, just sent them the usual cheerful updates about life on base. At night, she'd lie awake and replay the mission in her head, wondering if she'd made the right calls, if there was anything she could have done differently. On the 18th day, Major Carver found her in the Chow Hall. He sat down across from her without being invited, his face giving nothing away. "Investigation's over," he said quietly. "Colonel Vance wants to see you in 30 minutes. Dress uniform." Ryland's stomach dropped. Dress uniform meant official business, either commendation or court-martial. She nodded, stood up, walked back to her quarters in a daze. Her dress blues were pressed and ready. She'd prepared them days ago, just in case. She changed mechanically, fastened each button with hands that had finally started to shake. The walk to Vance's office felt like walking to her own execution. But when she entered, she found not just Vance and Carver but a dozen other officers crowded into the small space. And standing in the corner, wearing their combat uniforms and looking slightly uncomfortable, were Lieutenant Marcus Holt and 3 of his Marines. Vance stood at attention, Captain Ryland Kess front and center. Ryland's heart was hammering, but she marched forward, came to attention, kept her eyes straight ahead. Vance picked up a folder from his desk, opened it, and began to read. After thorough investigation into the events of November 7th, the inquiry board has reached its conclusions. Captain Kess, you are found to have violated multiple protocols regarding chain of command, airspace coordination, and combat authorization. Under normal circumstances, these violations would result in disciplinary action. Ryland felt the floor dropping away beneath her. However, Vance continued, the board also finds that your actions demonstrated exceptional airmanship, tactical judgment, and dedication to the protection of ground forces. Furthermore, your decision to engage, while unauthorized, prevented the loss of American lives and resulted in the successful defense of a Marine unit that would otherwise have been overrun. He looked up from the folder. The violations are noted in your file, but no formal charges will be brought. You're reinstated to full flight status effective immediately. The relief was so intense Ryland thought she might collapse, but Vance wasn't finished. Additionally, the Distinguished Flying Cross recommendation has been approved. You'll be formally awarded next month. He closed the folder, and his expression softened slightly. You scared the hell out of everyone in this chain of command, Captain, but you also reminded us why we're here. Welcome back to flight status. Thank you, sir. Ryland's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. Holt stepped forward then, his Marines flanking him. He extended his hand and Ryland shook it. Ma'am, I just wanted to say this personally. What you did that night, that's why we trust the Air Force. Not because of the protocols or the procedure, but because of pilots like you who understand what it means to have our backs. One of the Marines, a lance corporal who couldn't have been older than 20, added, "We were saying our prayers when we heard your voice on the radio, ma'am. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Then you came in with those guns, and it was like watching an angel with a chainsaw. Most beautiful thing I ever saw." The room laughed and the tension broke. Ryland felt herself smiling, really smiling for the first time in weeks. Just doing what anyone would have done, Lance Corporal. "No, ma'am," Holt said quietly. "Most people would have followed orders. You followed something else." The ceremony for the Distinguished Flying Cross took place on a clear December morning, with the Hindu Kush visible in the distance like a reminder of where it had all happened. Most of the squadron attended, along with a surprising number of Marines who'd somehow found reasons to be at Bagram that day. Ryland stood at attention while a general she'd never met pinned the medal to her dress uniform and read the citation. The words felt surreal: extraordinary achievement, selfless dedication, valor under fire. What felt real was Holt and his Marines standing in the front row, and the way every A-10 pilot in the squadron watched with expressions that said they understood. This was what they'd all signed up for. This was the mission that mattered. After the ceremony, Carver pulled her aside. "You're back on the flight roster starting tomorrow. We've got a lot of work ahead, and we need our best pilots in the air." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet." Carver's smile was thin. "You're about to discover that being a decorated pilot means everyone expects you to be perfect on every single mission from now on. No pressure." He wasn't wrong. Over the following months, Ryland flew more combat sorties than any other pilot in the squadron. She became the go-to for danger-close missions, the one the JTACs requested by name when they needed precision under fire. Her call sign, Whisper, took on an almost mythic quality among the ground forces. There were stories, some true, some embellished, about the pilot who talked soft but carried the biggest gun in the Air Force. But the truth was simpler and harder than the legend. Ryland was just a pilot who'd made a choice, and who had to live with that choice every day. She thought about the men she'd killed on that northern ridge, wondered if they'd had families, if they'd thought they were fighting for something righteous. She thought about the Marines she'd saved, wondered how many of them were still in country, still taking fire, still waiting for someone to come help. The A-10 community understood this complexity. They were all apostates together, the pilots who'd chosen the ugly, slow, vulnerable jet because they believed in the mission more than the glory. They flew low and slow because that's where the fight was, where the infantry needed them. Spring turned to summer, and the deployment continued. Ryland's flight logs grew thick with missions: convoy escort, overwatch, armed reconnaissance, and her specialty, danger-close air support. She and her Warthog became a familiar sight in the skis over Helmand and Kandahar and Kunar provinces, the distinctive silhouette of the prompting cheers from troops who knew what that gray cross in the sky meant. In July, she flew a mission that would later be classified and never fully discussed. A special operations team had been compromised deep in hostile territory, and extraction was impossible under fire. Ryland arrived overhead with two other A-10s, and for 45 minutes they held off an enemy force 5 times the size of the team on the ground. She went Winchester, expended all her ammunition, and stayed on station anyway, making dry passes just to keep the enemy's heads down until the rescue helicopters could arrive. The team leader sent a single message after they were extracted: "Whisper is a guardian angel." By August, Ryland had flown 112 combat missions. She'd fired her cannon 47 times in anger, dropped 92 bombs, and launched over 200 rockets. She'd never missed a target, never hit a friendly, never lost an aircraft to enemy fire. Her jet had taken damage twice, small arms fire that pocked the titanium bathtub but never came close to her vital systems. Each time, she'd flown the wounded bird home and landed safely, while the crew chiefs shook their heads in amazement. The squadron started keeping track of her statistics, not out of competition, but out of something close to reverence. In the A-10 community, where the mission mattered more than ego, Rylan represented an ideal they all aspired to. She was proof that the old, ugly jet could still be the most important aircraft in the theater when American lives were on the line. But the weight was accumulating. Every mission added to the burden she carried, the responsibility of life and death compressed into split-second decisions at 300 knots and 200 feet. She slept less, flew more, and spoke even quieter than before. In September, she met a young Army captain named David Rourke at the base gym. He was a Kiowa Scout helicopter pilot, stationed at a forward operating base but visiting Bagram for a mission brief. They struck up a conversation over terrible coffee in the DFAC, and he mentioned he'd heard of Whisper. "You're famous, you know," he said with a grin. "Every pilot in Afghanistan knows about the A-10 driver who went rogue to save those Marines. It's like the modern version of a gunfighter showing up just in time to save the town." Rylan grimaced. "That's exactly the kind of reputation I didn't want." "Why not? You earned it." "Because now every time I fly, people expect miracles. And war doesn't work on expectations. It works on preparation, luck, and sometimes just the grace of God." She paused. "Plus, I wasn't trying to be heroic. I was just trying to do the right thing." Rourke studied her for a moment. "You know what I think? I think you don't give yourself enough credit. Most people talk about doing the right thing. You actually did it, even though it could have ended your career." They talked for an hour, about flying and deployments and the strange unreality of being in combat. Rourke was thoughtful and funny, and for the first time in months, Rylan felt like she was talking to someone who understood the complicated emotional landscape of being a combat pilot. Before he left to return to his fob, he asked if he could write to her, and she said yes. The letters became a lifeline. Rourke wrote about his missions flying reconnaissance along the Pakistani border, about the beauty of the mountains at sunrise, about the small moments of humanity that persisted even in war. Rylan wrote back about the A-10, about the satisfaction of precision strikes and the nightmares that sometimes followed, about the strange loneliness of being both celebrated and isolated. In October, Rourke's Kiowa was shot down during a reconnaissance mission. He and his co-pilot survived the crash but were killed during the ground firefight that followed. Rylan got the news from a somber intelligence officer who knew they'd been corresponding. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. She had a mission scheduled for the next morning, and men on the ground were depending on her to be sharp and focused. So she packed the letters away in a box, wrote a brief note to Rourke's family that she would send when she got home, and went to the flight line to pre-flight her jet. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Kowalski who'd been maintaining A-10 since the First Gulf War, noticed something different about her that morning. The way she moved through the pre-flight checks, the particular care she took with every switch and dial. He'd seen it before in other pilots, the ones who'd lost friends and were channeling their grief into pure mechanical focus. "Captain," he said quietly, "you good to fly today?" Rylan looked at him and her eyes were clear. "I'm good, Sergeant. This jet ready to do work." "This jet's always ready when you're flying it, ma'am. You two got an understanding." The mission was routine overwatch for a convoy moving through a known IED belt. Rylan flew high and alert, her eyes scanning the roads below for any sign of disturbed earth or suspicious vehicles. The convoy made it through without incident, and she landed back at Bagram with a feeling of hollowness that had nothing to do with the mission itself. That evening she sat in the chapel, a converted shipping container with folding chairs and a simple cross on the wall. She wasn't particularly religious, but she needed somewhere quiet to think about work, about all the people she'd known who weren't coming home. A chaplain found her there an hour later, sitting in silence with her hands folded. "Would you like to talk?" he asked gently. "I'm not sure what there is to say, Chaplain. People die in war. That's what we signed up for." Knowing something intellectually doesn't make the emotional reality any easier. Rylan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I save people. That's my job, that's what the A-10 does. But I couldn't save David. I wasn't there. Nobody was there. He died in some godforsaken valley doing a mission that probably didn't even matter in the grand scheme of things." The chaplain sat down beside her. "Every mission matters to somebody, Captain, and you can't save everyone. The weight of that will crush you if you let it." "Then what do I do with it, the weight?" "You keep flying, you keep doing what you're good at, and you remember that for every person you couldn't save, there are dozens who are alive because you were there." He paused. "The Marines you saved in November, Lieutenant Holt got married last month. One of his sergeants just had a baby daughter. Those lives continue because of you. That's not nothing." Rylan nodded slowly. The chaplain was right intellectually, but the emotional reality, to use his phrase, was that war took and took and took, and sometimes saving lives just meant postponing the inevitable for a few more months or years. But she kept flying. That was the only answer she knew. The deployment ended in December, exactly 1 year after it had begun. Rylan rotated back to the States along with the rest of her squadron, landing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson to a welcome ceremony that felt both celebratory and surreal. Her mother was there, along with her brother, and seeing them made Afghanistan feel like something that had happened in another life entirely. The distinguished flying cross on her uniform drew attention. People thanked her for her service, shook her hand, asked for photographs. She was polite and gracious, but inside she felt disconnected from all of it. The real work was happening thousands of miles away, with new pilots flying her missions, new Marines pinned down and calling for help. During her post-deployment leave, she drove to Colorado to visit Rourke's family. They welcomed her with tears and gratitude, showed her photographs of David as a child, as a teenager, in flight school. His mother gave Rylan a model of a Kiowa helicopter that had sat on his childhood desk, and told her that David had written about her in his last letter home, said he'd met someone who understood the war the way he did. Rylan kept that model on her desk for the rest of her career. It became a talisman of sorts, a reminder of what was at stake every time she strapped into the cockpit. Back at Davis-Monthan, she settled into the routine of garrison life, training missions, academic work, the bureaucracy of peacetime Air Force operations. It felt hollow after combat. She attended the formal ceremony where she received her Distinguished Flying Cross from a 3-star general who gave a speech about valor and sacrifice. The medal joined her other ribbons and awards, but it never felt like something she'd earned. It felt like something she'd been given for just doing her job. The nightmare started that spring. Not every night, but often enough. She'd dream about the northern ridge, about the line of explosions walking across the rocks, about faces she'd never actually seen but her mind invented anyway. She'd wake up in her base housing apartment, covered in sweat, the sound of the GAU-8 still echoing in her ears. She went to the flight surgeon, who referred her to a psychologist. The sessions helped, gradually. She learned techniques for processing combat stress, for separating the necessary violence of war from her sense of self. The psychologist was a veteran himself, a former Marine who understood that sometimes the hardest part wasn't what you'd done, but the fact that you'd do it again if the situation required it. "You're not broken, Captain," he told her during one session. "You're exactly what a combat pilot should be, effective under pressure, willing to take risks to save lives, and human enough to be affected by what you've seen and done. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." By summer, she was cleared to return to full flight status. The squadron commander assigned her to the instructor pilot program, training the next generation of Warthog drivers. She discovered she had a talent for teaching, for taking complicated tactical scenarios and breaking them down into digestible lessons. The young pilots looked at her with something close to awe when they learned about her deployment record, about the night she'd saved those Marines. "Don't make me into something I'm not," she told one class of students. "I'm just a pilot who got put in a position to help, and I did what any of you would have done. The real lesson isn't about being a hero. It's about being competent, staying calm, and trusting your training when everything else goes to hell." But the students saw through the deflection. They understood that Whisper was exactly the kind of pilot they aspired to become, technically skilled, tactically sound, and willing to put everything on the line for the people on the ground. The years passed. Ryland deployed twice more, once to Iraq, once to Syria, flying combat missions against ISIS and providing overwatch for special operations. She racked up more flight hours in the A-10 than almost any other active pilot. She made major, then lieutenant colonel. She was offered staff positions at the Pentagon, opportunities to move up the career ladder into command and policy roles. She turned them all down. She wanted to stay with the jets, with the mission, with the young pilots who needed to learn what close air support really meant. In 2031, at the age of 42, she was given command of her own squadron, the 354th Fighter Squadron, the same unit she deployed with 15 years earlier. By then, the A-10 was scheduled for retirement, replaced by more advanced multi-role fighters that the Air Force insisted could do everything the Warthog could do and more. Rylan and the other true believers fought the decision at every level, arguing that no other aircraft could provide the low, slow, close support that ground troops needed. They lost the bureaucratic battle. The last A-10s were scheduled to be retired by 2035, flown to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan to join hundreds of other aircraft in the desert, their mission obsolete in the eyes of policymakers who'd never flown close air support in their lives. Ryland's squadron was one of the last to transition. On a hot September morning in 2034, she flew her final mission in the A-10, a simple training flight over the Arizona desert with none of her students, just her and the jet she'd spent 20 years flying. She took it low over the saguaro forests and Red Rock canyons, pushed it through aggressive maneuvers that would have been inappropriate for a farewell flight, and finally brought it home one last time. When she shut down the engines on the ramp and the turbofans spooled down into silence, she sat in the cockpit for a long time, her hands resting on the controls, remembering every mission and every moment that had brought her to this point. Sergeant Kowalski was waiting when she climbed down. He was older now, grayer, just a few months from his own retirement. He'd maintained her aircraft for nearly 2 decades, had been there for every deployment and every return. "That's it then," he said quietly, "end of an era." "End of the best jet the Air Force ever built," Ryland replied. "But that's not what bothers me. What bothers me is thinking about the next time a Marine unit is pinned down and calling for help, and the jet that shows up can't get low enough or stay long enough or hit accurately enough because it was designed to do a dozen different missions instead of the one that matters most." Kowalski nodded. "They'll figure it out eventually. They always do, probably after they lose some people they shouldn't have lost. That's what I'm afraid of." The squadron held a decommissioning ceremony the following week, with speeches and presentations and a flyover of the remaining Warthogs. Ryland gave brief remarks about the history of the aircraft, about its record in combat, about the pilots and maintainers who'd made it legendary. But what she really wanted to say, what she couldn't say in an official ceremony, was that they were making a mistake, that air power without the ability to provide intimate support to ground forces wasn't air power at all, just expensive fireworks. After the ceremony, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Holt found her. He was a colonel now himself, commanding a Marine regiment, but he'd made sure to attend the A-10's retirement. They hadn't seen each other in years, but the connection was still there, the bond between the pilot and the men she'd saved. "I thought you should have this," Holt said, handing her a framed photograph. It showed a group of Marines in combat gear standing in front of an A-10 somewhere in Afghanistan. Rylan recognized some of the faces from that night 15 years ago. At the bottom, someone had written, "Phantom 2-1, we're still here because she was there." Rylan felt her throat tighten. "Marcus, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just know that those 23 Marines went on to serve honorably, to have families, to live lives they wouldn't have had without you. Some of them are colonels now, some are teachers. One's a police officer, one's a doctor. One of them named his daughter Rylan." Holt smiled. "Your legacy isn't just about one night or one mission. It's about all the days that came after, all the lives that continued. Don't ever forget that." After he left, Rylan sat alone in her office, holding the photograph, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from grief or regret, but from the overwhelming weight of gratitude. Gratitude that she'd been given the opportunity to make a difference, that she'd been in the right place at the right time with the right skills to save lives. It was more than most people got, and it was enough. She retired from the Air Force in 2036, after 24 years of service. Her career had taken her from flight school to combat zones to command, and through it all she'd remained faithful to the mission of close air support, of protecting the men and women on the ground who depended on air power to survive. At her retirement ceremony, the commander of Air Combat Command presented her with her final award, a Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious service. The citation mentioned her combat record, her leadership, her dedication to training the next generation of pilots. It was comprehensive and complimentary, and completely failed to capture what she'd actually done. But then her former student, now a major leading his own A-10 squadron in one of the few remaining units, stood up to give unofficial remarks. He told the story of Whisper and the Marines, about the pilot who'd gone rogue to save lives and changed what it meant to be a close air support pilot. "Ma'am," he concluded, "you didn't just fly the mission, you became the mission, and every one of us who was lucky enough to learn from you carries that forward. The A-10 might be going away, but what you taught us about duty and competence and caring for the people on the ground, that's permanent. That's your real legacy." The applause was thunderous. Rylan stood at attention, her eyes forward, her face composed. Inside, she felt a sense of completion, of having done the work she was meant to do. Civilian life was strange and quiet. She bought a small house in the mountains of Oregon, not far from where she'd grown up. She consulted occasionally for defense contractors, helped design training programs for the pilots who would fly the new generation of close air support aircraft. She wrote articles for military journals about the importance of the CAS mission, about the lessons learned from decades of combat operations, about why air power had to remain focused on supporting ground forces. She also spoke at military schools and conferences, always emphasizing the same themes: competence, dedication, and the sacred trust between pilots and the troops they protected. Young aviators would approach her afterward, asking for advice, asking about that night in Afghanistan, asking how to become the kind of pilot she'd been. "There's no secret," she'd tell them. "You just have to care more about the mission than you care about yourself, and you have to be willing to make hard choices when the situation demands it. Everything else is just practice." In 2041, she received a letter from a young Marine lieutenant she'd never met. He explained that his father had been one of the Marines in that wadi back in 2024, that he'd grown up hearing stories about Whisper and the night she'd saved his dad's life. Now he was deployed to Afghanistan himself, and he wanted her to know that the legend lived on, that her name was still spoken with reverence by ground forces who understood what she'd represented. "You gave my father 30 more years of life," the lieutenant wrote. "He was there for my childhood, my graduation, my wedding. He'll be there when I come home from this deployment. None of that would have happened without you. I wanted you to know that your split-second decision to help strangers had ripples that are still spreading, touching lives you'll never meet. Thank you for everything you did, everything you represented. You're the reason I trust the Air Force to have our backs." Rylan kept that letter on her desk beside the model Kiowa helicopter. They were reminders of what had mattered, what still mattered. The medals and awards and formal recognition were fine, but these personal connections, these individual lives that had continued because of choices she'd made, were the real measure of a career's worth. As she grew older, she watched the evolution of military aviation with a mixture of interest and concern. The new jets were impressive, technically sophisticated, capable of amazing things. But she worried that in the pursuit of technological advancement, the Air Force was losing touch with the fundamental mission of supporting troops in contact. Air superiority and strategic strike capabilities were important, but they didn't mean anything if you couldn't protect the infantry when they needed help. She wrote opinion pieces, gave interviews, stayed engaged with the conversation about close air support doctrine. Some people thought she was stuck in the past, unable to accept change. Others understood that she was defending a principle that transcended any particular aircraft, the principle that air power existed to protect people on the ground, and that every decision should be evaluated through that lens. In 2048, the Department of Defense quietly reinstated a limited number of A-10s to active service after after-action reports from several conflicts showed that newer aircraft couldn't provide the same level of sustained support in complex ground battles. The jets were pulled out of the boneyard, refurbished, and assigned to specialized close air support units. It was a tacit admission that the retirement had been premature, that there were missions only the Warthog could fly. Rylan read about it in Aviation Week and allowed herself a small smile. She'd been right all along, but more importantly, the troops who needed that kind of support would have it available. That was all that really mattered. In her 70s, she was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of her career, particularly that night in 2024. She was reluctant at first. She'd never sought attention or celebrity. But the filmmaker convinced her that the story was important, that it represented something larger about duty and sacrifice, and the relationship between air and ground forces. The documentary, titled Whisper, The Pilot Who Went Rogue, premiered in 2052 and became unexpectedly popular. It told her story with honesty and nuance, including interviews with Holt and several of the Marines she'd saved, with fellow pilots, with military historians. It placed her actions in the context of close air support doctrine and the ongoing debate about how to protect ground forces in modern warfare. The response was overwhelming. Rylan received thousands of letters and emails from veterans, from active-duty service members, from military families. They thanked her for her service, for her dedication, for representing the best of what military aviation could be. Some shared their own stories of close air support missions, of pilots who'd saved their lives. Others simply said that her example had inspired them to serve, to pursue aviation, to hold themselves to higher standards. On November 7, 2054, exactly 30 years after that night in the Hindu Kush, a ceremony was held at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The A-10 training squadron that still operated there dedicated their building to Colonel Rylan Kess, placing a plaque near the entrance that read, "Dedication to mission above all. Let this serve as a reminder that our purpose is measured not in sorties flown but in lives protected." Rylan attended, now 82 years old but still sharp and articulate. She spoke briefly about the importance of the close air support mission, about the responsibility that came with flying for the military, about the young men and women who continued the tradition she'd been part of. When she finished, a group of Marines in dress blues marched onto the parade ground. They were led by Marcus Holt, now a retired general, and they included several of the men from Phantom 2-1 who were still alive. They rendered honors to the woman who had saved their lives 3 decades earlier, and the symbolism was clear. The bond between air and ground, between pilot and infantry, was permanent and unbreakable. Rylan stood at attention, returning their salute, and felt the full weight of her legacy settling onto her shoulders. It wasn't about the medals or the ceremonies or even the documentary. It was about this, the knowledge that when it had mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, she had been there. She had done the work. She had kept faith with the mission. That was enough. That would always be enough. The ceremony concluded with a flyover, 4 A-10s in missing man formation, the slot position empty in tribute. The sound of their turbofans echoed across the base, and everyone who heard it understood what it meant. The Warthog was more than just an aircraft. It was a promise, a commitment, a symbol of the covenant between those who flew and those who fought on the ground. Rylan watched the jets disappear into the Arizona sky, and she smiled. Whisper's work was done, but the mission would continue. New pilots would carry it forward, would make their own choices in moments of crisis, would write their own stories of dedication and sacrifice. The sky was vast and blue and full of possibility, just as it had always been. And somewhere out there, someone was calling for help. And somewhere, a pilot was already turning toward the sound, ready to answer. That was the legacy. That was what endured. Not the individual acts of heroism, but the endless repetition of commitment. The daily choice to serve, to protect, to stand between danger and those who depended on you. Rylan had made that choice every day of her career, and in doing so, she had become more than a pilot. She had become a guardian, a symbol, a reminder of what military service could mean at its best. The sun was setting over the Sonoran Desert as the ceremony ended. Rylan accepted handshakes and well wishes from dozens of people, posed for photographs, shared quiet moments with old friends and former students. But her mind was elsewhere, flying through memory and time, back to that pre-dawn morning when she'd heard a desperate call for help and decided that permission mattered less than lives. She had been Whisper then, young and uncertain but determined. She was still Whisper now, older and wiser, but no less committed to the principles that had guided her. As night fell and the crowd dispersed, she stood alone for a moment on the flight line, looking at the darkened shapes of the A-10s parked in their revetments. They were just machines, metal and composite and avionics. But in the right hands, with the right heart behind the stick, they became instruments of salvation. That was the real lesson of her career. Not that one person could make a difference, though that was true. Not that heroism existed, though it did. The lesson was simpler and more profound, that duty was its own reward, that competence in service of others was the highest calling, and that the measure of a life was found in the lives it protected. Rylan had lived that lesson. She had flown it, fought it, embodied it. And now, in the twilight of her years, she could look back and know with certainty that she had spent her time on Earth well. The stars were emerging overhead, the same stars that had watched over her missions in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. They were eternal and indifferent, but the work done beneath them, the protection of the vulnerable, the defense of the innocent, the unwavering commitment to duty, that work mattered. It had always mattered. It would always matter. Whisper had answered the call. The echo of that answer would resonate through generations, a testament to one pilot's choice to put mission above protocol, lives above regulations, and service above self. In the end, that was all anyone could ask, and it was everything.